was one of those nights when the air felt like it carried secrets. I couldn't tell you why I was out so late, wandering the empty streets instead of heading home. Something just pulled me along, like an unseen thread, until I found myself staring at a large, crumbling mansion at the end of a dead-end street. I'd walked these blocks before, but I'd never noticed the place. Odd, considering it loomed so ominously over the street, its gabled roof jagged against the low-hanging fog. There was something almost theatrical about it. The mansion looked as if it had been pulled from the backdrop of some Gothic play, a perfect set piece if the night wanted me to play the role of the curious stranger. A wrought iron gate, rusted and clinging to life, creaked open just slightly, as if waiting for me to enter. I probably would have walked away if it hadn't been for the note, just barely visible under a street lamp's faint glow. Scrawled in a hasty, almost desperate script, it read, "The housekeeper has left. Inquire within." I stared at it, feeling that creeping sense of trespass, like a child daring to step into the dark corner of an attic. And yet there was a pull I couldn't ignore. I was alone, and nobody would know if I peeked inside. I told myself I'd just knock on the door, maybe find some quirky caretaker with stories to share. But deep down, I think I knew that whatever waited inside wasn't some lonely old man. The mansion had a presence of its own. I nudged the gate open. It groaned as I pushed through, and the stone path to the front door was overgrown, vines weaving through cracks like veins in old skin. The front door itself was massive, painted black and almost hidden under the weight of years. When I reached for the tarnished brass handle, it turned easily, as if the door had been waiting for me. Inside, the grand foyer was draped in shadows, but moonlight streamed through a high, arched window, illuminating dust motes that floated lazily in the air. My eyes adjusted to the dimness, and that's when I saw it, a portrait hanging alone on the far wall. It was of a woman, late 20s maybe, dressed in an old-fashioned Victorian gown that seemed to almost blend with the shadows behind her. Her face was pale, her expression blank but unsettlingly intense, her dark eyes gazing directly at me as though she had something important to say, yet couldn't. I stepped closer, unable to resist the strange pull of her stare. The artist had painted her with unsettling precision. Her face was so lifelike that, for a moment, I imagined her taking a slow, deliberate breath. Her dark hair fell around her shoulders, framing a face marked by a sadness that seemed to have sunk deep into her very soul. The closer I got, the more I felt that her eyes were not simply painted. They were alive, watching me as much as I watched her. And then I noticed it, a faint dark line on her neck, like the shadow of a bruise, barely visible under her collar. I blinked, certain I was imagining it. But no, the shadow was there, almost imperceptibly darker than the rest of her skin. A chill skated down my spine as I reached out, not to touch it, but to trace the outline with my eyes. There was something horribly wrong about the woman in the painting, something that went beyond brushstrokes and canvas. A slight rustle behind me broke the silence, and I spun around, heart pounding. But there was no one there. Just the empty grand hallway, silent as a grave. I looked back at the painting, but it was exactly as it had been before, with that same sorrowful gaze, the same faint bruise on her neck. And yet, it hadn't been there when I first looked, had it? Or had I simply missed it? I didn't know what I'd gotten myself into, but I had a gnawing feeling I wasn't the first to wander in here, drawn by some dark compulsion. The woman in the portrait seemed to know that too. Her eyes, resigned yet desperate, seemed to warn me. Once inside, you won't leave as you came. I Couldn't shake the feeling that the woman in the painting was watching me, her gaze holding an intensity that felt almost human. I lingered in the foyer longer than I intended, transfixed by those dark eyes and that faint bruise on her neck, as if she had a story to tell but couldn't speak. The air was thick, pressing down on me like a silent warning. Still, curiosity gnawed at me, and before I knew it, I was moving deeper into the house. The mansion seemed to breathe around me, each creak of the floorboards and distant whisper of wind through cracked windows adding to the unsettling atmosphere. I walked through the hall, my footsteps muffled by a thick layer of dust, past old tapestries that sagged on the walls, their colors faded, but their figures still haunting. I turned a corner and found myself in a long corridor lined with portraits, each one more disturbing than the last. They were all in the same style, Victorian, somber, and painted with uncanny realism. But as I walked down the line, I noticed that each of the figures seemed off. One man had a twisted grimace that bordered on agony, while a child in another portrait wore a look of frozen terror. I could almost feel their fear reaching out from the frames, an unspoken plea lingering in the air. Every few steps I glanced back at the doorway to the foyer, half expecting the woman in the first portrait to be peering around the corner, watching my every move. Her image lingered in my mind, her bruised neck and haunting eyes. I felt certain that if I returned to her portrait now, something about her would be different. At the end of the hall, I opened a door that led into what looked like a drawing room, dimly lit by the pale moonlight spilling in through a cracked window. An old, faded sofa sat beneath a grand chandelier thick with cobwebs. The scent of decay clung to the air, and an unsettling silence blanketed the room, as if it hadn't seen a visitor in decades. As I moved toward the fireplace, I caught sight of something out of the corner of my eye. A mirror, tall and tarnished, leaning against the wall. In the mirror's reflection, I could just barely see the hallway behind me and something else. There, in the dim light, a shadow shifted near the doorway, a faint outline that seemed to waver, as if watching me from the darkness. I spun around, heart racing. There was nothing there. Just the empty hallway, quiet as before. I swallowed hard, telling myself it was a trick of the light. But when I looked back in the mirror, the shadow was gone, leaving only my pale, anxious face staring back at me. The mirror seemed to distort my reflection, stretching my features in a way that made me look like I was fading into the shadows around me. I tore my gaze away, suddenly feeling as if I'd looked at something I wasn't supposed to see. Turning back to the drawing room, I noticed another portrait hanging above the fireplace. It was the same woman from the foyer, her image repeated but different. This time, her expression had changed. Her eyes were wide with panic, and the faint bruise on her neck had deepened, darkening into an angry purple mark that seemed almost fresh. I took an instinctive step back, my mind scrambling for an explanation. Had someone tampered with the painting? Changed it while I was wandering through the house? No, it was impossible. But as I stared, the bruise seemed to darken, as if blooming before my eyes, spreading down her neck like a handprint. I could almost feel the weight of invisible fingers on my own throat, tightening, pressing down. The air around me thickened, each breath feeling harder than the last. I stumbled back, reaching for the door, but something made me hesitate. Her expression had shifted again, a look of resignation crossing her face, like she knew something terrible was about to happen. Like she'd been here before, trapped in the walls of this house, powerless to escape whatever curse bound her image to the canvas. And that's when I heard it, a faint, soft whisper. At first I thought it was the wind slipping through a crack in the walls, but as I strained to listen, I heard it again, clearer this time. My name, spoken so softly it was barely more than a breath. I froze, my mind racing. Who would know my name here? I felt the chill of the house wrap around me like a shroud, my heartbeat thundering in my ears as I realized something. I was no longer alone. The whisper lingered in the air, as if my name had dissolved into the walls themselves, reverberating from somewhere deep within the house. My skin prickled with an instinctive fear, and I felt the overwhelming urge to leave, yet I couldn't pull myself away. It was as if the walls held some magnetic force, pulling me further in even as my mind screamed at me to turn back. I took one last look at the woman's face in the portrait, noting how the bruise on her neck now seemed grotesquely vivid, her expression frozen in terror. The painting had changed again. Her once pleading eyes now looked hollow, the look of someone resigned to a fate they couldn't escape. I didn't know why, but I had the sudden, unsettling feeling that I was somehow a part of that fate. Shaking off the dread, I forced myself to move, leaving the drawing room and retracing my steps back down the hall. But each portrait I passed seemed to shift as I walked by, subtle changes in expressions or shadows around their faces. I could almost feel their eyes following me, each figure trapped in its own silent agony. A wave of nausea rolled over me and I quickened my pace, desperate to reach the front door. When I reached the foyer, I stopped cold. Something was wrong. The doorway to the outside was gone. I blinked, rubbing my eyes as if I could clear some illusion. But there was only a blank wall where the door had been, as if it had never existed. Panic clawed at me. I spun around, scanning the walls, my heart pounding harder as I realized I was trapped. The house, it seemed, had closed itself around me. I took a shaky breath, trying to calm my thoughts. Think, I told myself. This was just an old house, an empty relic. The door was here when I entered, so it must still be here. Maybe I'd taken a wrong turn in my confusion. But as I turned to head back down the corridor, a flicker of movement caught my eye from across the room. The portrait of the woman was changing. This time I watched in horror as her mouth began to twist open, slowly forming into an anguished scream, though no sound escaped her painted lips. The bruise on her neck darkened further, almost black now, as if an invisible hand were pressing harder and harder against her throat. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I watched her agony unfold in real time, like I was witnessing some terrible play meant only for me. I wanted to look away, but my body wouldn't obey. I was transfixed, helpless to move, as I watched her face twist and contort, her eyes widening as if pleading with me to do something, to somehow save her from this terrible fate. It was as if she was trying to tell me a secret, something that could set both of us free. And then I felt it, a cold, creeping pressure on my own neck, like icy fingers brushing against my skin. I gasped, stumbling backward, the air suddenly thick and oppressive. My breath hitched, and I felt as though I, too, were being strangled, a slow, unyielding pressure tightening around my throat. A shadow flickered at the edge of my vision, just a quick, darting movement that made my pulse race even faster. I turned, catching sight of something in the far corner of the room, a dark, indistinct figure, barely visible but undeniably there, watching me with silent intensity. It was just a shade, a wisp of darkness that seemed to hang in the air, its presence filling the room with a sense of foreboding. Who are you? I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its attention on me, heavy and unyielding. I took a step back, my fingers grazing the wall as I tried to steady myself, desperately searching for a way out. But as I did, the figure moved, gliding across the room in an unnatural, almost liquid motion. It stopped in front of the portrait, one dark hand reaching up to touch the woman's bruised neck, a gesture that felt intimate and horrifying. In that moment, I understood. The entity, whatever it was bound to the portrait. It wasn't just an observer. It was the cause. The bruises, the terror in the woman's eyes. They were all marks of its torment, a lingering imprint of every horror it had ever inflicted. The entity's shadowed face turned slowly toward me, and though it had no eyes, I could feel it locking onto me, its cold gaze settling over me like a shroud. The walls seemed to close in even tighter, the air thickening until it was almost suffocating. I knew then that I had only two choices. Stay here and become another portrait on the wall, or find some way to break the hold this creature had over the house, and over me. I could barely think over the hammering of my own heartbeat. The realization had settled into my bones. I wasn't just a visitor here. I was prey. The entity held my gaze, its form shifting like shadows in smoke, hovering by the woman's portrait. I backed away, but with each step, I felt its presence growing heavier, a pressure that seemed to sink into the very walls. My hands fumbled along the surface behind me until my fingers closed around the cold edge of a candelabrum on a side table. It was heavy, a solid piece of metal that felt like it could be a weapon, though deep down, I doubted it would do any good. Still, clutching it gave me a sliver of courage. Desperation urged me forward. I knew, instinctively, that there was something binding the entity to this house, something ancient and twisted. The portraits, all those tortured faces, perhaps they had all been trapped here, one by one, pulled into its web just as I was. I had to break the cycle, and that's when it struck me. The portrait. Somehow it was a part of this curse, a link between the entity and the suffering it inflicted. Destroying it might be my only way out. But as I moved toward the painting, the entity shifted, blocking my path with a silent warning. Its dark form stretched across the room like an ink stain, cold tendrils extending outward, brushing against my skin like icy fingers. I felt a jolt of pain flash through me, almost like a shock, and I stumbled back, my grip tightening on the candelabrum. The entity hovered there, waiting, as if daring me to make my move. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from that shadow as possible, but I forced myself to stay, focusing on the portrait behind it. The woman's face had contorted further, her eyes locked onto mine, pleading with a silent urgency that chilled me to the core. She knew, as I did, that this was my only chance. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and swung the candelabrum at the entity's form, hoping that somehow it would break through. But the metal passed through it like smoke, cutting only empty air. The shadow wavered, then reformed, inching closer, as if mocking my feeble attempt. A flash of frustration surged in me, a spark of something primal that overpowered my fear. I lunged toward the painting, bringing the candelabrum down against its glass surface with a force I didn't know I had. The glass shattered, splintering outward in a web of cracks. Behind it, something strange caught the moonlight. A thin, translucent film, almost like a second layer behind the canvas. The entity hissed, a sound like wind slicing through the narrowest of spaces, and I felt its anger vibrate through the room, filling every inch of the air with a rage that nearly suffocated me. But I didn't stop. I reached out, tearing at the canvas, feeling a strange, sticky resistance as I pulled the layers apart. Beneath the painting, embedded within the wall, was a hidden compartment, the faint outline of a door that had been sealed away and painted over. With shaking hands, I pried it open, revealing a small, dim space within. Inside, an old, dusty book lay open, its pages filled with tight-scrawled writing. There were diagrams, strange symbols, notes in a language that looked almost familiar, yet impossible to decipher. But as I flipped through the brittle pages, one entry caught my eye, written in a hurried, desperate script. The house demands sacrifice. To break the curse, one must burn the portraits, each one a memory of pain. The Keeper of Souls will resist, but fire is the only salvation. The Keeper of Souls. I glanced back at the dark entity hovering beside the woman's portrait. It wasn't just a spirit then. It was something older, something bound to this house by blood and history, feeding off the lives it ensnared. And I was the latest in a long line of souls it would claim if I didn't act now. I gathered what little courage I had left, ripping the portrait of the woman from the wall and setting it down on the floor, my hands shaking as I struck a match. The flame wavered in the damp air, but I held it steady, letting it catch the edges of the torn canvas. The fire took slowly at first, licking at the bottom of the portrait, and then, as though hungry, it spread faster, engulfing the painting. The woman's face began to distort, twisting in the flames, her expression shifting from horror to something softer, almost relieved. A piercing wail erupted through the room, and I staggered back, covering my ears. The entity writhed, its form shrinking and flickering like a candle about to go out. The flames climbed higher, illuminating the room in a wild, dancing light, and I felt a rush of heat, almost unbearable, as though the house itself were burning from the inside. As the painting burned, the entity began to dissolve, pieces of it breaking away, sucked into the flames. It made no sound, no scream, but the air was filled with a profound sense of release, as if countless trapped souls were finally free. And then, as suddenly as it began, the flames died down, leaving only ashes where the portrait had been. The darkness lifted, and a deep, unearthly silence filled the house. The front door stood open, moonlight streaming through, inviting me back into the world beyond. I stood in the center of the now silent foyer, catching my breath, heart still racing from the horror I just endured. The air was different, lighter somehow, as if a heavy weight had lifted, but a dark residue still lingered, clinging to the walls like a shadow that didn't belong. Outside, the moonlight beckoned through the open doorway, pure and cool, promising freedom. I took a step toward it, half convinced this was some trick, another illusion to keep me bound to the house. But the light held steady, and I felt a small sense of relief swell in my chest. I was almost free. Still, I couldn't shake the lingering chill, the sense that there was something left undone. A part of me urged to make a break for it, to run into the night and leave this cursed place behind. But another part, the same part that had pulled me into this nightmare, whispered that I had to look back, just one last time. I glanced over my shoulder, letting my eyes drift back to the charred remains of the portrait. Only ashes remained, scattered in a small, blackened pile on the floor. But I could still feel the woman's presence, her desperate, pleading gaze that had drawn me into this house and its darkness. I wondered who she'd been, what story her soul carried, trapped in these walls. Had she been the first, or merely one in a line of unfortunate souls claimed by this house? The other portraits along the hallway seemed unchanged at first, their twisted, pained expressions still frozen in place. But then I noticed something strange. The darkness in their eyes seemed to have faded, as if a shadow had been lifted. The lines of tension in their faces appeared softer, less burdened. It was subtle, but unmistakable. I took a few steps back down the hallway, unable to stop myself from looking at each one. The child's face, once contorted in terror, now wore an expression of peace, eyes closed as if in sleep. The man with the twisted grimace now seemed almost serene, his features softened in repose. The portraits had changed, each one released from whatever agony had kept them bound to these walls. I felt a strange warmth wash over me, a quiet thank you radiating from the faded figures. Yet even in this newfound peace, a nagging feeling crept over me, a dread that whispered I wasn't completely free. I forced myself to look away, making my way to the front door, driven by an urgency to leave. I stepped through the doorway, feeling the cool night air hit my face, cleansing away the stale, oppressive weight of the house. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the fresh air, letting it calm the remaining tremors in my body. But as I walked away, the feeling of being watched settled over me once more, an uncomfortable prickling on the back of my neck. I resisted the urge to turn around, telling myself it was over, that whatever had haunted the house had been put to rest. Yet the urge grew stronger, like an itch in my mind that I couldn't ignore. Finally, I stopped, heart pounding again as I turned to look back at the house. It loomed silently in the night, dark and still, its windows empty and cold. I shivered, telling myself it was just a trick of the mind. But then I saw it, something faint, nearly invisible but undeniably there. In one of the upper windows, a shadow stood, its form barely discernible against the darkness inside. My breath hitched as I realized it was watching me. It was impossible to tell if the figure was the woman from the portrait or the shadowy entity I'd encountered, but it felt strangely familiar, as though the house itself was bidding me farewell, or perhaps marking me as its own. The figure didn't move, didn't waver. It only watched as I stood frozen in the yard, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. I forced myself to turn away, to keep walking. Whatever had happened in that house was over. I had to believe that. But as I put distance between myself and the house, a final thought crept into my mind, unbidden and chilling. Perhaps I had escaped the house, but some part of me would always be tied to it, just as those souls had been. And perhaps on some quiet, lonely night, I might feel that inexplicable urge to return, a pull I wouldn't be able to resist. I walked faster, unwilling to look back again. The night stretched before me, empty and cold, and yet I felt a shadow lingering just behind me, close enough to feel but too far to see. And in the silence, I could almost hear it, a faint whisper, like a sigh. The house was gone from view, but its darkness would follow, a shadow that would linger with me, always just a step behind.